Congratulations! Through a huge mistake in the paperwork, you now own the Sahara, all 9.2 million square kilometers of it, which is bigger than the continental United States, spread across 10 countries plus a disputed territory, a place that multiple countries argue over who owns it. There's one catch. It looks like the single most worthless piece of real estate ever handed to anyone. Sand to the horizon. Almost nothing growing. Almost nobody living there. You appear to own a very large, very hot patch of nothing. And yet under one corner of it sits the oil and gas that funds nearly half of Algeria's government budget. Under another sits roughly 70% of the mineral the whole world needs to grow its food. Across it moves a cash economy of people smuggling worth around $100 million a year to a single town. Turns out, the flattest, emptiest sand is the best treasure map on Earth because it's a giant dark tray that catches rocks falling out of the sky. In July 2025, one rock a desert traveler picked up off the Sahara sold for $5.3 million. But before you spend a single dollar, let's look at what the people who actually run this place are doing right now. This is an ocean of sand across 10 countries with almost no people, no roads, and no obvious way to make a dollar from a sandhill. And yet the most visible money on your desert comes from the sand itself. The first thing people actually pay for is the sand itself. People pay for the look of the place without needing to own a grain of it. In southern Morocco sits a town called Ouarzazate, nicknamed Ouarzawood. It's home to Atlas Studios, the largest film studio in the world by area. Gladiator was shot here in 1998. Russell Crowe in Roman armor, walking across Saharan sand that was pretending to be ancient Europe. Game of Thrones filmed here. The Mummy filmed here. A crew helicopter set pieces onto an empty dune, builds a fake alien town, shoots for a few weeks, then removes the set and leaves. The sand goes back to being sand. The hotels in Ouarzazate have been growing about 40% each year. Morocco's foreign visitors have risen from around 7 million to over 10 million a year. Then there's the stranger example. Tatooine is real, and it's in Tunisia. The original Star Wars shot Luke Skywalker's home planet around the town of Tozeur. A film set from one of the movies still stands there as a tourist site. A famous chase scene was filmed at a rock formation in the desert. George Lucas even lifted real North African Berber village names for Tatooine's moons: Gomrassan, Germessa, Chenini. The mechanism is almost too simple. A crew builds a fake world on your sand, films a pod race, packs up, and then tour operators drive visitors out to photograph themselves on another planet. The Sahara sells the same emptiness twice, once to Hollywood, once to tourists. So the desert looks like nowhere on Earth, and that's a business. But the real money is what's underneath. Remember, this whole vast emptiness is yours now. The desert is not just big, it's politically insane. 10 countries claim pieces of it, plus a disputed territory whose ownership nobody agrees on. Every single one of the fortunes we're about to walk through sits on ground someone else thinks is theirs. So before you start counting your money, let's look at the first of those fortunes. The one everyone assumes is down there. And it really is. The most obvious guess about what's under your desert is also the first one that actually pays, and the numbers are genuinely absurd. Under the Algerian Sahara sits the oil and gas industry that funds nearly half a national government. The big one is the Hassi Messaoud oil field, discovered in 1956, still the country's most significant. Paired with it is the giant Hassi R'Mel gas field. From 2020 to 2024, oil and gas made up nearly 83% of Algeria's exports. They also provided almost 46% of the government's budget, so almost half the government's money comes from this corner of the desert. Other reporting says oil and gas are over 95% of export earnings. In just the first 3 quarters of 2024, Algeria's oil and gas export revenues passed $34 billion. The state operator, Sonatrach, plans to invest around $50 billion to boost output. The scene is a single pump jack nodding up and down in empty sand at Hassi Messaoud, a pipeline running north to the Mediterranean. Nothing around it for hundreds of kilometers. No city, no farmland. A visitor sees worthless desert. The operator sees nearly half the national budget flowing through a pipe. Close to half the government's money comes from one corner of your desert, and nobody outside the energy industry ever thinks about it. They just fill up their car. So the oil and gas under Algeria pay for a government. But that's the obvious thing. Turns out another corner of your desert grows the world's food. And one company, one state-run Moroccan company, controls most of the mineral that makes it possible. Morocco's OCP group controls an estimated 70% of the world's phosphate reserves. Phosphate is the mineral crops cannot grow without. It's a key ingredient in fertilizer, the stuff farmers spread on fields from Brazil to India to Europe. OCP doesn't just sell rock, it sells the input that is essential for the entire global food supply, and it posted record revenue of roughly $9.76 billion in 2024. At a mine called Bou Kraya in the disputed territory of Western Sahara, phosphate rock is carried to the coast on a conveyor belt about 100 kilometers long. the longest in the world. The belt drags crushed rock across empty desert to a port, and the white dust blowing off it is visible from space. The mine holds over 1.7 billion tons of reserves and produces around 3 million tons a year. Baucrea sits in Western Sahara, a territory the United Nations classifies as non-self-governing. No other country, and not the UN itself, recognizes Morocco's claim to it. The Sahrawi independence group called the Polisario Front and human rights groups argued that extracting phosphate without the consent of the native Western Sahara people, the Sahrawi, breaks international law. The European Union's top court has ruled that EU trade agreements with Morocco cannot cover produce from Western Sahara. So, the person eating bread in Madrid is indirectly eating the Sahara. And the ownership of that exact patch is one of the world's longest-running disputes. Your empty desert isn't just valuable, it's contested precisely because it's valuable. Remember that pipeline from Hassi Messaoud, the one feeding ships to Europe? The phosphate conveyor is the same idea on a huge scale, except instead of fuel, it's food. And it's 100 kilometers long, and you can see the dust cloud from space. So far, we've got oil funding a nation, phosphate feeding the planet, both buried under your sand. But there's one resource in the Sahara that's not buried at all. It's infinite, it's free, and it's blazing down on your desert every single day. And yet for 2 decades, the smartest investors in Europe have tried to connect a cable to it and failed. The Sahara's sunlight is the clearest proof of the rule that nothing here has value until you move it to where people need it. The sunlight is infinite and free and worth almost nothing until someone solves the boring problem of moving it 3,000 kilometers to where people actually live. 3 stories tell the whole arc. First, the dream that died. In 2009, a group of companies called Desertec formed with a plan to harvest Saharan solar and pipe it to Europe at a projected cost of around 400 billion euros. The consortium collapsed after big investors, including Siemens and Bosch, stopped investing. Regional political instability killed it, and the cost of European solar panels fell so fast that building giant plants in the desert stopped making sense. Second, the one that actually got built. Morocco's Noor Ouarzazate complex is one of the world's largest concentrated solar power plants. It has a field of roughly 2 million mirrors. It generates around 510 to 580 megawatts. The project cost is cited around $9 billion. It works. It also costs billions to produce only a small part of the promised electricity. Third, the current dream stumbling. A project called X-Links aims to lay the world's longest underwater power cable, 3,800 kilometers, to carry 3.6 gigawatts of Saharan solar to Britain. That's enough for up to 8% of UK electricity. The reported cost is close to £20 billion, but the UK government has withdrawn its backing, and the project hasn't received final approval yet. Stand in the Sahara at noon. The sun is blazing down on sand nobody uses, an infinite ocean of free energy. And 3,000 kilometers away, a corporate board in Europe is realizing something. The political instability and the cable cost just killed another project. Being able to move it matters more than having it. Now we shift tone. So far, we've talked about oil, phosphate, and sunlight, things you dig up or collect. But there's an economy crossing your desert that moves something entirely different. And the money it generates is not in the billions of dollars of a state company. It's in the hundreds of millions in cash flowing through a single desert town. That town is Agadez in Niger. For years, the Sahara has been the first and deadliest part of the migration route toward Europe, and moving people through it has been one of the biggest cash businesses in the Central Sahara. The emptiness is a corridor. In 2016, an estimated 333,000 migrants passed through Agadez, with a peak of around 72,000 in a single month. A huge human current. The migration industry was worth around $100 million a year to the Agadez regional economy. It fed drivers, organizers, landlords running migrant houses, mechanics, and shop owners. Around 3,000 people a week, each paying about $800. So a huge number of people move through and a lot of money changes hands. Then politics got involved. Under pressure from the European Union, Niger passed a law in 2015 that made migrant smuggling a crime. Enforcement destroyed Agadez's economy. Then, after a military takeover in July 2023, the new military government canceled the law in November 2023, and the trade moved back into the open. On a set day each week, pickup trucks loaded with people line up on the edge of Agadez and drive north into open Sahara toward Libya. A broken axle, the bar connecting the wheels, out here can be a death sentence because there is no next town. The desert's emptiness is exactly what makes it both a smuggling corridor and a place where many die. The death numbers are an open, contested question. The International Organization for Migration says probably more migrants die in the Sahara than in the Mediterranean, but it's virtually impossible to know. Bodies disappear in the sand. Since 2014, the IOM recorded over 19,000 deaths in the Mediterranean. It recorded about 1,900 in the Sahara, but everyone agrees the Sahara numbers are far too low. The emptiness hides the evidence. Everything we've talked about, oil, phosphate, sunlight, people, all makes a kind of sense. They're things governments and companies fight over. But the strangest money in your desert is the one nobody controls at all. It just falls out of the sky. The Sahara doesn't just have meteorites, it preserves and displays them. A dark space rock is nearly invisible in a green forest and rots in wet soil. On bright, completely dry Saharan sand, it stands out and survives for thousands of years. The same rocky, lifeless emptiness that made the Sahara look worthless in the intro is the exact property that makes it a treasure field. Flat, dry, and pale enough that a black rock from another planet waits in plain sight for someone to walk by. Common stone meteorites are recovered from the Sahara essentially by the ton and sell for about 50 cents a gram. The rare stuff is a different universe. Moon and Mars rock sell for thousands of dollars per gram. Get this. In July 2025, a meteorite called NWA 16788 sold for a record $5.3 million. It was sold at a famous New York auction house after a 15-minute bidding war. It weighs about 54 pounds. That's the largest piece of Mars ever found on Earth, roughly 70% bigger than any other. It was recovered from the Sahara in November 2023. For scale, back in 2020, a 30-pound lunar meteorite found in the Sahara sold for $2.5 million. Picture a desert traveler on foot, eyes down, crossing sand that a tourist would call the definition of nothing. He stops and picks up a fist-sized dark stone. 2 years and one auction later, that rock becomes the most expensive meteorite ever sold. That's your desert. It looked like the emptiest, most worthless place you could possibly be handed. But it turned out the sand hides many things. Oil that funds a nation, phosphate that feeds the planet, sunlight nobody can sell, $100 million people-moving economy, and a literal rain of treasure from Mars. So that's your dessert, the oil and gas under Algeria that funds nearly half its government, the phosphate in Western Sahara, which the world's food supply depends on, the sunlight nobody's figured out how to sell, the $100 million cash economy of people moving through Agadez, and the rocks from Mars falling onto your sand and selling for millions. The Sahara isn't empty, it's just that all the value is hidden, under the sand, inside the emptiness, or falling from the sky. Your worthless patch of nothing turns out to be one of the richest, strangest, most contested pieces of ground on Earth. The only people who think it's empty are the ones who haven't looked down or up. Congratulations, owner! Now you know where the money really is.